Hello, my name is Jason Leck. I'm an escalation engineer within Microsoft Dynamics GP. We're going to look at service-based architecture, which is a new feature for Dynamics GP 2015, and what we're going to focus on is the installation itself. For the agenda, we're going to start by looking at a brief overview of what service-based architecture is. We're going to look at its prerequisites, and then we're going to dive into the deployment for service-based architecture, which for those that have been implementing web client will find that it's very familiar and all those skills are transferable. And then lastly, we're going to validate the deployment. So for the overview, a lot of you are probably asking, what is service-based architecture? So in its simplest sense, it enables REST-based integrations with Dynamics GP. So this is an alternative to using SOAP or WSDL-based web services. The functionality existing in the dictionaries is exposed as a service call. Now the key to that statement is that the same logic used by the GP client is used here. Now often with our integrating products, what we have an issue with is we have two different code sets for doing the same process. With service-based architecture, we have the same code base, meaning that when a new feature is added, it's then instantly available as service-based architecture. Now, when we talk about the design, now I had mentioned that those that have done web client are going to be very comfortable with deploying service-based architecture. And the good part is they're in the same install, which makes it that much easier. But it'd be kind of good to see the design perspective from how web client differs from service-based architecture. So let's start with web client. Now, as you know, our web client, our browser, hits a website, which in turn calls the Session Central service, which then, depending on whether a session is created or not, creates that session with the session service. Now, let's assume we're coming in and we're creating a brand new session. That information is then relayed back to our browser, and then the browser connects to the Dex process directly. Now that process is well known, but let's look at how this differs from service-based architecture. In it, we have these service consumers that are coming in, they're hitting the GP service, and then in turn hitting the Dexterity Service Controller, which in turn hits the Dex process. And we'll discuss these components here in a little bit, but let's assume that the service consumer coming in hits GP service and spins up a new Dexterity process. Now the difference here is actually twofold. The first one, in the web client side, the web client is allowed to hit the Dexterity process directly, which for those that have worked with web client would be that runtime process exe, and it requires that stateful connection. So should the state ever be broken, what's going to occur in Silverlight is you're going to see an async error. So the service-based architecture side never connects to the Dex process, and because it's only connecting to the GP service, that connection is stateless. So let's give a quick example. We had a network hiccup somewhere. In the web client, we would be disconnected because it's noticing that its connection to the Dex process is broken, and it wants to ensure that nothing happens to damage data on the GP SQL side. In service-based architecture, if the packet is lost between it and the GP service, it's just simply sent again. And then at that point, our data flows into the Dexterity process side. So it's different in those two ways. So let's dive into what those components for service-based architecture are. First of all, there's the GP service. So that serves as our entry point for the service, and it's just a WCF web service. The session host is just a machine. So it's just a machine that holds the GP client for us, just like the session host would be in web client. The two that are probably going to be most relatable in another sense are our Dexterity Service Control and our Dexterity Service. Our Dexterity Service Control manages the Dexterity Service instances just to make sure that we're sending it to the one that has the greatest amount of resources to handle it. And the Dexterity Service is the one that executes the request it gets from the runtime service or from the GP service. Where I see this the similarity to this is with process server. To me, the distributed process manager is our Dexterity Service Control, and it's just managing the distributed process server, which would be our Dexterity service, if you were to use that as an analogy for those two. So once again, we're going to hit the GP service. It's going to send it to the Dexterity Service Control. It's going to determine which service has the most availability, and it's going to send it to that Dexterity service. So let's look at our prerequisites for the install. Now, the first one's going to be Internet Information Services. This feature, the web server feature, is going to be required if we deploy the web management console, which you would obviously want to install. So for that reason, it's listed as a prerequisite. Now, on the right, you're going to see all of the components that have to be installed for the web server feature. Now, typically, I know on my own installs, what I find is the only one of these that's not deployed is Windows Authentication, and that one would be it. Now, depending on your operating system, it may be a little bit different, so you'll want to ensure that the ones that are installed on the right are listed as installed. The next piece is going to be, there's two items. One, we have to have an SSL certificate bound to the website for the deployment of the web management console. Obviously, if we're choosing not to install the web management console, we don't have to have the certificate, but we will need it for the installation when we're specifying the GP service. Next, the website must be exposed to .NET Framework 4.0, and you'll see in that screenshot in the lower right, to get to it, once you choose the website that's been bound to your SSL cert, you'll have to expand the ASP_net, expand the system web, and then you should see it. Now, if you don't see it and you know that ASP.NET is deployed, you can run through Knowledge Base Article 306005, and you basically browse out to the .NET Framework 4 folder, and you run ASP.NET_regis-I, and that will install it for you. Some operating systems don't allow you to run ASP.NET_regis, and then if you're one of those, it'll tell you in the window that you can't. In your command prompt, it'll tell you can't. You just have to make sure you uninstall and add back the .NET Framework component, and that should take care of it for you. So, the next one is one that I'll be the first to admit I missed it the first time. And that is, inside your GP client install, you have to install the feature for service-based architecture. Now, when we installed the web client, it needed this web client runtime, and it deployed a folder in your GP client folder. This one will just simply deploy some assemblies in the root of your GP client folder. But that one is a requirement that has to be there for a client to be installed, and that will actually have 2 additional windows in the install that will help you do the installation of service-based architecture, and this does drop down a Windows service for you. Next, in utilities, we're going to need a SQL Server login for the web client to be set up. And now, for those of you that remember, this was introduced with Identity Management in Dynamics GP 2013. And what this allows us to do is map a GP user to a Windows login. So for the background on it, you would really want to look at one of the videos for Identity Management with GP 2013 R2, because that'll really go into depth on explaining it. But at a high level, what it allows is the user that you set up here is not a user in GP, but is a user in SQL that has access to all the database objects that it needs to have access to. So that login cannot be used because its password is encrypted, but we need it so that we can tie our GP user to a Windows login so that SBA will work. So one thing to make sure that we do when we create this login and password, make sure you note it, because we're going to need it during the configuration of whether the install for a single tenant or in tenant services for a multi-tenant. We're going to need the login name and password we pass here. So we also need to do some work in Dynamics GP. And so let's discuss the 3 items we need to do. Now that we've got that setting done in utilities, we can now map that domain user to a GP user, and we do that on the user setup window. The next piece we need to do is ensure that the GP user that we have has access to the companies that the domain user is going to need to integrate with. The last thing, the GP user must have access to the resources in GP that the domain user will integrate, and that's done from the user security setup window. So let's give an example of what that means, because it might have sounded a little bit cryptic there. So let's say my domain user needs to integrate customers. The first thing, my domain user is going to have to be set up as a GP user. The next, the GP user is going to need to have access to the company, let's say it was Fabricam, so that I can integrate into Fabricam. The last part is, my GP user is going to need to have access to customer maintenance in order for me to integrate in those customers into Fabricam. So once those three are set up, I have the setup I need in Dynamics GP. Now the last prerequisite is only required if we're planning a multi-tenant environment. So if we do, tenant services has to be deployed. Now the documentation can be found for tenant services can be found in the documentation manuals folder of your GP 2015 media, and specifically it's in the TS install admin guide.pdf. Now the installation has to be done and those services have to be running, but no setup needs to be done beyond that. So you wouldn't have to set up the tenant or the users or anything at this point. The only thing that's really required is that the install is done and the services are running. So next, let's look at the deployment of service-based architecture. Now, once again, I had mentioned that the installation is very similar to the web client installation. So those of you that have done one before, this will seem second nature to you. So again, the install is found on the GP 2015 media. Now, I will add that all the screenshots that I have in here in this process are for both a single or a multi-tenant install, so that I'll point out when one will specifically be in or not be in, but it just makes it run a little bit easier than running through the process twice. So the first thing on the GP 2015 media, we're going to select web components. Now you may have been like me and question, why do I see web client and web components right next to each other? And when I did a testing, they both do the exact same thing. Now, the reason web client was there was because we had web client there in 2013, but moving forward, it will be web components will be the only one there that moves forward. So it'd be a good time to just start using and continue to use web components as your option. Once selected, we're going to get to the license agreement window, and on it, we just simply need to select I accept the terms in the license agreement and hit next. Once we hit next, we're going to be taken to the installation option window, and on here you have two options: single machine, which installs the pieces that are typically installed, or custom, which will let you customize how the pieces are installed. Personally, I would always choose custom because we have a little bit better repair options available for us. So once you hit custom, we're going to be taken to the select features window. Now on the select features window, what you're seeing are the components that would be installed just for service-based architecture and for a single tenant. Now we can deploy service-based architecture and web client together. I just wanted to show what would be the differences if we didn't. Now you'll notice that for the service-based architecture side, the GP service and the Dexterity Service Control are both installed. On the web management console side, I have the SBA session manager piece selected. If I were to install with multi-tenant, or my intent was to install multi-tenancy, then I would also include the tenant manager snap-in, because you'll need that for the creation of your tenant. So once you've selected those components and you hit next, you're going to be taken to the Web Components database window. And on here, you're specifying the SQL Server and with instance if it's applicable, and your database name for the GP configuration database. And you're given the option to either do Windows Trusted or SQL Auth for its creation. Once you supply those creds and the information, you're taken to the Windows User Group window. And on this window, For us, since we only chose the service-based architecture pieces, we only get the bottom half, which is the web management console users. And this would be users or groups that that need access to the web management console. So these would be your administrators that you'd want to have access here. Once you've entered that information, and if you had multiples, separated them with commas, you'll hit next here, and you're taken to the tenant configuration window. Now, obviously, if I'm a single tenant deployment, I don't mark anything and I hit next. If I'm installing with multiple tenants though, I check that box and I'm going to be asked to populate the the discovery service and the management service. Now on the management service side, I'm going to need to look, if you want to know where the URL is, if you look in the Microsoft.Dynamics.multitenantservices.discovery.config, which by default, if you go to the location you installed it, will be in the Discovery Services folder or Discovery Service folder. You'll see the base address listed in there, and that's the one that you'll want to populate for that window. The second field for management service will be found in the Microsoft.Dynamics.multitenantservices.management.config file, and that will be found in the management services folder of the default location that you installed it to, and you'll just open it up, copy out the base address, and put it in there. It does validate the URL, so if you do type it in wrong, it's going to let you know that it couldn't contact those endpoints. So once we hit next on that window, we're taken to the Web Management Console configuration window. So it's going to require that website that you want to put the Web Management Console has an SSL certificate bound to it. So when you hit that drop-down menu, you'll just select that website. Now, if you had failed to bind an SSL cert to that site, you can keep the current state of the install where it's at, go to IIS, bind the site, and hit the refresh button, and it'll go back out, pull that information, and then repopulate the list. So that is one good feature of it. But once that's selected, the bottom half of the window, you just need to select an application pool identity for the Web Management Console. So once you enter in the domain user, the password, the domain, the username, and the password, you can just click the next button. On the GP configuration window, this window is only displayed if we had a single tenant. In multi-tenant deployments, this window is just bypassed. So on it, we'll talk about the second part of that later. On the single tenant side, we would be entering in the SQL Server login name and password, and those would be the two that we entered in Dynamics Utilities. Next, we'd choose the GP instance name. Now, don't confuse this with the GP SQL Server instance name. This would be the instance of GP. So the first install of GP that you do, its instance name is default. The second one is a named instance that it requires you to name. So let's say the first one was default and the second one was GP 2015. If you were trying to expose GP 2015, then you'd have to put GP 2015 in the GP instance name. The last three fields relates to the GP client that you're using for service-based architecture. The first will just be the GP client folder, and the path to the second two, which is the Dynamics set and the Dex-ini, will have to be the path to those two resources with the file names included. Now, if I had selected multi-tenancy, I'm going to be asked for this exact same information. The difference being I'm going to be asked for it in tenant services when I'm setting up the application settings for it. All right, so then once we enter this information in, we'll be taken to the GP service window, which is our WCF service that is required to have an SSL cert. So from the drop-down menu, we'll select the certificate that we want to bound. That certificate obviously has to have server authentication as its type. And we'll choose the host name, or I should say the host name is going to default in. We'll want to validate the host name. Now you'll notice the port defaults in as 443, but really we could use any port that's available. If we keep it at 443, the advantage is most hardware and software firewalls will allow 443 access. If you choose your own port, then you're going to have to make sure to account for it being available for incoming and outgoing traffic. And then we're going to need to provide a domain account for running the service for running the GP service. So once we've entered this information, we're actually taken to the last screen where we need to populate information in, and that's the Dexterity Service Control window. Since the user never connects to the Dexterity Service Control, we always go through the GP service, we're not actually required to put a certificate on this one. You can if you choose, but it's not required. So once you choose a port number or let it default in, you can then enter in the domain user and password for running that Dexterity Service Control. The only items to add would be if you chose to put these on multiple machines, meaning the GP service was on one machine and the Dexterity Service Control was on a different machine, you'd have to account for whatever port that you're using to be open on through any hardware or software firewalls that you set up. All right, so once you have this information set up, you'd go to Install Program and you'd click the Install button. Now, once the install is completed, just like Web Client, it's going to run a wizard for the database side. So that's going to fire up the Microsoft Dynamics GP Web Components Configuration Wizard. And on the welcome screen, we just click Next. We have to choose how we're going to connect to the database, and you'll notice that it dummies in the server name and the database name because we entered that in the installation itself. So once if we have access to the database, we would need to be DB creator and be an access admin at minimum. Or if we supply a login that does have those rights, we can hit Next here. And it's just telling us because of our install, we chose some service-based architecture components and some web management components. It's saying I got to configure the database for those two. Once it goes in, our configuration is complete and we hit Exit. That's the process for the install. Now, if we chose multi-tenancy, we have one more step to do. So in tenant services, we'd have to do that setup through the tenant services snap-in in the web management console. We'd have to do the following four things. We have to make sure the tenant is created, or we have to create the tenant, depending on if it was or it was not. We have to add users to that tenant. We have to add the GP service application to the tenant. And then lastly, we have to enter in the GP service application settings for the tenant. Now, the first three are documented in that Tenant Services Install and Admin Guide. And just as a reminder again, that's in the GP 2015 Media in the Documentation Manuals folder. Its file name is tsinstaladmin.adminguide.pdf. And those three are documented as far as how to do it. Now, the last one, I just want to show you what I had for one of my installs. And that's for the application settings for the tenant. You're going to notice again, it looks exactly like the window we did in the install for a single tenant. It's going to ask us for the path to our set and our dynamic set and our DexInit. For the SQL Server name and password, those are the identities that we supplied in utilities. And then lastly, the default, or the instance name, in my case, default, for GP. So once we've passed all of that information in, we have satisfied the requirements for what it will take for a domain user to connect to that endpoint. All right, so now let's validate the install, because that's probably the one piece that, from an installation perspective, and especially if you installed Web Client, your test was always, can I hit the login window and can I log in? On here, it's not as great because we're trying to hit the endpoint and make sure that it's valid. So let's first start with the services themselves. Well, I want to make sure that the three services we have at minimum are started. The first one, the GP Dexterity service, gets laid down when we install that feature, this service-based architecture feature in the GP client. Now, in the screenshot on the bottom right, that's the first one. So the service name will always be GP Dexterity Service dash the instance name of GP dash 14, and 14 being the major version. Now, the GP Dexterity Service Control and GP Service are both laid down with the installation of service-based architecture. Now, it's possible we have more than three. So in the sense where we were doing multi-tenancy, and I have two GP clients laid down, both of them with service-based architecture, then I would see GP Dexterity Service -default -14 and GP Dexterity Service the name I called it, GP 2015 -14. So we can have more, but you'll want to ensure that all of the services that meet these are started before we attempt to connect to the endpoint. Next, we'll want to verify that we have access to the help URL. Now, the user that does the install should have access to this URL, at least from the first one. So what this does is this URL is really helpful for seeing examples on how we can use service-based architecture. Now, you'll notice there's two different URLs, and I want to point them both out. If I was an installing user, but I was not set up in GP, I could use the first one. If I was not the install user, or was the installed user, it doesn't matter, but I was set up in one of the have access at least in one of the companies, I can see the second URL as well. The difference being when you supply /companies and supply the company name, it's going to do some really nice stuff for us when we look at those examples. So let's talk about what we're going to see first, and then we'll explain why that's important to have that second one in. When you go out to /help, you're going to see the dictionaries and the object libraries that are available. Now, all the dictionaries that are exposed will show up in that list. If I were to select Dynamics, which is the Dynamics dictionary, I then get a list of categories, and you'll see that as the list of admin, company, financials, down to sales. If I drill into, let's say, inventory, for example, I can then see a list of all the inventory items that are exposed, one of which is items. And if I click on items, I can see all the different ways that I can interact with items from my GP service endpoint. If I were to use the second URL, when it gives me an example of how to use that type, it will be formatted in the exact way I need to use in my browser. So, for example, if I want to do a get of all my items, and there's an option for get, which is the HTTP request type that allows me to retrieve all of my items, I would copy that one out and I would paste it in my browser, and I would instantly get a list of all my items. If I choose the first one, the URL won't resolve because I'm required to have /company, so I would be forced to then append the URL to make it work. So once again, when we look in that help URL, it's going to give me my 4 HTTP request type at most, those being a get, which will get me a list. It'll retrieve a list of items or information on a specific item in this case. I could do a post, which would allow me to create an item. It'll allow me to do a patch, which allows me to update an item. And it allows me to do a delete, which would be to remove an item. Now, get can be done from a browser, but the other three cannot be done from a browser. Post, patch, and delete must be done from an application calling the endpoint, or you could also use Postman from Chrome, which will allow you to do those HTTP request functions. So that's the high level, right? That's the help level. That's just what can you do. Now the next level down is verifying that you can actually access that GP data. So here's some examples of pulling information out, right? So here are 3 gets that I would do. The first one would be retrieving vendor data, and that would be not specific to any one vendor. It would just be all my vendors. The next one is inventory items, and I'm specifically pulling out the 100 XLG. So just information on that item would be pulled out. And the last one's going to return me a company list. Now, obviously, if I don't have access to any or all of this information, I'm going to get a message that I'm an unauthorized user. Now, the last thing I want to point out is, if you'll notice, I'm appending a .xml to the end of the 3. By doing so, it's going to render the results in my browser. If I had chose to instead just not see them in the browser, but save them down to a file, I could just omit putting the .xml in, and it'll prompt me to save it as a JSON file, JSON. With a JSON file, I can open it up in any text editing application like Notepad. So if you can, so the key is, if I can hit one of these, and I have access to either vendor maintenance, item maintenance, or the ability to see companies in GP, if I can hit one of those three, I know that I've successfully set up service-based architecture. As always, thank you for continuing to watch these services for the new features. Feel free to ask any questions that you have, either through the forums or through a support request. And make sure that you also look at any of the other documentation for those new features that are out there. Thank you.